Hi, I'm Jeff Hodges. I'm the Grasslands Coordinator for the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative. I want to talk about the potential impact of Farm Bill and grassland birds and why we should have a native vegetation standard for the Farm Bill. As we get started, I want to give you a little bit of information as some background, and you start thinking about developing this roadmap. And the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative led a Natives First initiative. Natives First was an initiative to establish a native vegetation standard in the Farm Bill. Unfortunately, we weren't successful, but we were successful in getting native vegetation language in the conference report, where the managers encouraged the use of native vegetation for multiple conservation purposes where practicable. So an extension of that is our Natives Grasslands Alliance to create a voice promoting native grassland vegetation. And not only is the Native Grasslands Alliance addressing the policy issue, but there's other components that we need to be simultaneously addressing at the same time. So we developed working groups around policy and also including research, technical education, and awareness. So we can move forward with selling the idea of getting this native vegetation standard in the Farm Bill. So why do we need a native vegetation standard in the Farm Bill? Farm Bill programs are huge. There's over 140 million acres in federal farm conservation programs, and 132 million of those acres are in the three largest programs. Some of those here shortly. The conservation program had a 37 million acre high, had a 45 million acre cap, but never reached that cap. Currently, the enrollment is about 22 million acres with a 24 million acre cap, with that cap increasing to 27 million acres in 2023. And the annual outlay for that program is approximately $2 billion. There's a conservation stewardship program. Over the past 5 years, the average annual enrollment has been 7.2 million acres. And during the fiscal year 19, approximately 1.2 billion in financial assistance was obligated into that program. We also have the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, averaging about 11.8 million acres annually. And during fiscal year 19, approximately $133 million in financial assistance were dedicated to that program. So these programs either take land out of production, in the case of the Conservation Reserve Program, to be planted to permanent vegetative cover, or they apply conservation practices on working lands. These conservation practices might include filter strips, grass waterways. It may also include the development of prescribed grazing plan and many other things. These programs, Farm Bill programs, all represent a potential net gain for native grassland acres. In addition to the conservation programs, Farm Bill conservation programs, under the Farm Bill, the Sod Buster Program that provides an opportunity to plant or native vegetation. The Sod Buster, introduced in 1985 Farm Bill, requires that a conservation plan be developed when converting highly erodible land from grasses to row crops. One of the drawbacks is that it only applies to highly erodible land, so there's no protection for native grasslands on non-highly erodible land. And the other one is it allows producers to go ahead and convert native grasslands regardless, as long as they have a conservation plan in place. There's also the Sod Saver Legislation. It was introduced in a 2008 Farm Bill to limit the conversion of native grasslands to row crops. And it makes farmers ineligible for crop insurance on insurable crops for 5 years. Unfortunately, there was a loophole in that program that farmers exploited, and they would plant and grow uninsurable crops for that 5-year period, and then they would convert to row crops. The other drawback to that is it only applies to Iowa, Minnesota, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, and South Dakota. In its last Farm Bill, there was a failed attempt to make it nationwide in the last Farm Bill. We certainly want to look at trying to move that in the future Farm Bills and getting a Sod Saver in there. So I think with these examples, we can see how Farm Bill can have a significant impact at a landscape scale. Unfortunately, routinely, non-native vegetation is recommended for most conservation practices other than those dedicated to wildlife, and even many of those use non-native vegetation. This is especially true east of the Great Plains. There are a number of reasons for this, and really don't have time to go into all of those, but be aware that there are forces working against using native vegetation for multiple conservation practices. So without a native vegetation standard in the Farm Bill, non-native vegetation will continue to be favored over native vegetation, losing out on potential millions of acres of new native grasslands. So during our efforts with natives first, one thing that rang loud and clear, and ultimately what was the game changer, that any standard had to be voluntary and non-regulatory. And while that seems at odds with what I've said about the need for an emphasis on native vegetation, to remain voluntary and non-regulatory, it can be addressed through Farm Bill program rules related to incentives, ranking, and also informational campaign promoting the benefits of native vegetation, much like the current Soil Health Initiative. If the USDA were to adopt such an informational campaign for native grasslands, grasslands gains could be very impactful. Presentations about the reasons for a native vegetation standard in the Farm Bill, I wanted to take just a couple of minutes to talk about the potential of native forages on working lands that may or may not be enrolled in the Farm Bill program. According to the National Agricultural Statistics Service, most recent data from 2013, nationwide, there are a little over 109 million acres in non-irrigated pasture. And by USDA definition, pasture is a non-native grass. So more appropriate within the Bobwhite range and more aligned with the Mississippi Flyway, if we look at just the fescue belt, there's an estimated 35 to 40 million acres of tall fescue, which represents our greatest prospect for conversion of up to 10 million acres to native forages because of this win-win opportunity for producers and conservationists. So we're going to take a look at the Farm Bill and the impact that Farm Bill has on grassland birds. And I want to provide this disclaimer as I move forward here that most of the examples I provide are in relation to northern bobwhite. But if you'll use bobwhite as an umbrella or a circuit species, also understanding that there are some species that is not appropriate for, but we need to make the comparisons as best we can. So I've gone a long way to get to the point of why native vegetation standard would be important, just to get to the point about its impact on grassland birds. In their final report of the CP33 Habitat Buffers for Upland Birds Monitoring and Evaluation Plans, Evans et al. Found that breeding densities of northern bobwhites were 70 to 73% greater on fields with CP33 buffers. These CP33, that's Conservation Practice 33 buffers, were required to be planted in native forbs and grasses. And when compared to those without fall, they were 70 to 73% greater than those without those buffers. And their fall covey density ranged from 50 to 110% greater. The results from other bird species a little more variable. However, there was an overall increasing effect for dick thistle with increasing effect in some years, but not others for field sparrow, indigo bunting, eastern meadowlark, and vesper sparrow. And the authors concluded that CP33 buffers produced a positive and immediate response by bobwhites and several priority songbird species. When looking at whole field practices, those are the CP1 and CP2. CP1 is introduced non-native grass. CP2 are native grasses. Best et al. Found that species richness in January and February was greater on CRP than on row crop fields, illustrating CRP's importance as wintering habitat. Also, Riffle found that eastern meadowlark, dick thistle, eastern kingbird, common yellowthroat, and grasshopper sparrow were positively related to CRP greater or equal to 50% of the sites examined. Now, to be fair here, I need to tell you that information is lacking regarding the impact that EQIP and CSP programs have on grassland birds, and those do still need to be studied. Let's talk a bit about CRP management and spatial arrangement. While Farm Bill program acres, and particularly CRP, can have a positive impact on grassland birds, the management and spatial arrangement in which it is applied can increase that impact. In a recent study published by Yeiser et al., looking at the efficiency of CRP in the context of a focused landscape management, which they were looking at the MBCI Coordinated Implementation Program focal areas, it yielded two significant results. The first was that managed CRP practices have a much higher probability of providing a positive impact on bobwhites and other grassland species, and also that the importance of CRP to local populations declined with distance from CRP fields. One of the things they noted that count trends were greater in focal areas as compared to the reference areas for dick thistles, field sparrows, northern bobwhite, prairie warbler, and ring-necked pheasant. Now looking at the landscape context, and additional considerations are in relation to field borders. Bowling et al. Found that bobwhite density decreased as percent of urban pasture and forest lands increased. I might point out when we talk about pasture here, this is in the sense of the traditional pasture that we typically view it as. Fescue pastures may or may not be overgrazed. In relation to forest cover, West et al. Found that forest cover had greater influence on occupancy than native warm season grass treatment, and they looked at grazing, haying, seed production, and biomass production as the different treatments. Within 250 meters, the influence was negative for eastern meadowlark, grasshopper sparrow, northern bobwhite, and red-winged blackbirds, and within a kilometer, it was negative for field sparrows. Now, I've just used these one examples each, but there's also documented impacts of landscape context and forest cover on, there's also quite a bit of other documents out there, but I just kind of focused on these. So we'll kind of summarize here why we need a native vegetation standard for the Farm Bill. Number one, there are large acreages enrolled in Farm Bill program, 140 million acres. And that gives us a potential for landscape scale impact. There's a lot of money dedicated to Farm Bill conservation practices. As you've seen, there are billions of dollars. It provides a win-win opportunity for landowners and conservation, particularly when looking at things like forage quality. When we can improve the bottom line for the landowner by getting them to adopt native warm season forages, they can realize greater gains on cattle, so it improves their bottom line. Native vegetation standard was also, as we've demonstrated, provides a positive impact on grassland birds, but not just grassland birds. It also includes soil conservation, water and air quality, soil health, and quality summer forage, as we just talked about. But some additional considerations are that we need to understand that focal areas are important. The shotgun approach of scattered CRP is not going to yield the kind of results that a focal area would. And also, at least in terms of bobwhite and a handful of other grassland birds, landscape context is important, not only the spatial arrangement, but also the proximity to forested lands and other urban uses and other uses. And then finally, why we need a native vegetation standard is there is a culture of misinformation and traditions within technical advisors that are hindering the adoption of native vegetation. So as we move forward developing the Grasslands roadmap, I think it's important that we keep Farm Bill programs and working lands under consideration for their potential landscape scale and impacts. That's all I have today. Thank you very much for your attention.